All right, welcome to the last of the four first river valley civilizations. This is topic 1.3a, river dynasties in China. The goal here, like always in these first few lessons, is to be able to describe the key aspects of this time early Chinese civilization. We'll, of course, explore their technology, their religion, how they rose to power, how their governments governed people, the rights people had under these structures, and problems that these societies experienced. All right, just so you can see where these civilizations are in relation to each other geographically, over here we're going to be looking at this yellow section, the river valleys in China, specifically between the Yangtze and the Yangtze rivers. Sometimes the Yangtze is called the Yellow River. You can see over here, this is where the Indus Valley is. That's where we had a different lesson on Mesopotamia and Egypt. So we're kind of traveling west to east roughly in these lessons in this first unit. First question, how did their civilizations start? Where did they come from? So geographically, as I just mentioned, the civilization starts between two main river valleys. So again, we're seeing that common theme in these early civilizations of people settling along fertile river valleys. Again, in this case, it's the Yellow or Yangtze River and the Yangtze River down here. So right in between these two. These rivers, like the other rivers, have a habit of flooding, and this is really great for farming in some ways because it brings fertile silt, fertile soil, down from the highlands down to the lowlands, which you have all the nutrients you need to grow crops and farm. However, this flooding is very unpredictable, right? The Nile, the great thing in Egypt is that it was very predictable. You knew when it was going to flood, you knew where it was going to flood for the most part, and so you could plan for that. But in China, not so much. And in fact, another problem they had was that the flooding was so severe and unpredictable that it would just create flash floods, destroying entire villages, not just the crops. And in fact, only 10% of the land in this region was really good for farming, and this, of course, is going to lead to conflict. Right? If only 10% of the land is good for growing food, then people are going to fight over control of the land where the food is grown. If you look at the map over here on the right, you're going to notice that this area of China has some geographic features that are going to stand between it and its next closest neighbor in these early civilizations, the Indus Valley, right? So they're pretty separated here by deserts, but also mountains, and then to the east you see they're isolated by the Yellow Sea over here. This is really good for them because it does provide some natural protections, theoretically, but it also isolates them from the other civilizations, so trade is not going to be as easy for them. And while those barriers do provide some protection, there are going to be some nomadic peoples up here known as the Huns that are going to be coming in from the north and the west, and it's going to cause some real headaches for the Chinese people. Now, the earliest evidence we have of Homo sapiens, our species, arriving in China is about 45,000 years ago. Now, farming settlements begin along the Huanghe, or the Yellow River, around 2000 BCE, so that's about 4,000 years ago. This means that we've had people living in China as hunter and gatherers for roughly about 40,000 years before they begin farming. Now, you'll excuse my pronunciation here, I'm not really good in Chinese pronunciations, but in legends it says the very first family to unite these different settlements is the Xia dynasty, and they're said to have built different irrigation and flood control systems that made this region much more predictable, so farming was safer and they could produce more food. Now, I say it's legendary because there isn't exactly a lot of hard evidence that this dynasty existed, but traditionally it is taught as the first dynasty, but the first archaeological dynasty we have, that comes next, the one we have actual archaeological evidence, that's called the Shang dynasty. We'll get there. So that first historical dynasty, of course, as I just mentioned, was the Shang dynasty, and they were known for building walled cities in this area. So we have a lot of archaeological evidence here. We do know there's irrigation systems and flood control systems that were built prior to the Shang dynasty, but whether or not there was a dynasty, a family known as the Xia that was in control, that's a little unclear. Let's talk about the role of trade and technology in this civilization. We're going to talk about two different types of trade real quick. There's inter-civilization trade and intra-civilization trade. Inter-civilization trade would be trade between two different civilizations. Now, as I mentioned earlier, China is kind of isolated by deserts and mountains from these other civilizations further out west, and so there really isn't any contact between them. Eventually there will be. It'll be a very famous trade route known as the Silk Road. They'll travel from east to west, but in these early days, that trade route just doesn't exist, as China is isolated from these cultures. As a result, they turned to more intra-civilization trade, so local trade. It's the Zhou dynasty in 1027 BC, which overthrew the Shang dynasty before that, that really starts to promote this local trade by building roads and canals, encouraging people to trade with each other within their dynasty, and helping promote agriculture and farming through this trade. Because you'd grow more because you know you can get to the next village over to sell it. And so that's kind of one thing that the Zhou dynasty brought to the table. Another innovation the Zhou dynasty brings to this region at this time is coined money. Now, coined money makes trade a lot easier. So you can see here some examples of the coins used at this time. So it doesn't look like the circles you're familiar with. If you don't know why this is such an important innovation, stop and think about what life would be like if we did not have money, right? Imagine you wanted to go to the store and you wanted to buy a pizza for dinner, but there was no money. So if you wanted the pizza, you had to show up with something the pizza maker wanted that they would trade for in exchange for that pizza. And if you didn't have anything they wanted, then you wouldn't get the pizza. Having an agreed upon currency, coins, this just makes it much easier because you only have to bring the coins with you. You know they'll accept the coins. You just have to barter for how many coins they want for their pizza. And so this is a really big innovation that continues to encourage trade between these local cities that are all under the control of the Zhou family. Another new innovation that develops near the end of the Zhou dynasty are blast furnaces that are capable of reaching very hot temperatures, hot enough that they can actually take iron and melt it so they can just pour it into different molds, allowing for mass production of identical weapons and tools. Literally all you're doing is you're heating the iron ore up to a temperature until it becomes a liquid, and then you pour it into the shape that you want it to form into, you let it cool. It's a little more complicated this, but essentially this is how you get mass production of identical items. I think it's pretty obvious why this is so valuable, especially I think from a military context, right? You can quickly produce a lot of weapons to quickly arm a lot of people. The Chinese also invent pictograph writing on their own. They're one of the areas of the world that develops a writing system completely independent of everyone else. Right, we looked at cuneiform in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphics in Egypt. A third area this writing develops is China, and they start to use characters or pictograph-like symbols like we saw in hieroglyphics, like we saw in cuneiform, right? It seems to be a common theme where each symbol represents a different idea, a different sound in the Chinese pictograph language, but it's very difficult. There's a lot of them you have to know, thousands of them, and because it's so difficult to use, it really is only the wealthy, the rulers, the priests who have access to this. However, because it's not linked to a specific language, just sounds, it means people who speak different languages can use the same writing system to represent those sounds, allowing communication between these different language groups. And this is one of the things that helps to unify China. And one thing there's a misunderstanding about is that there is not one quote Chinese language. There's actually a lot of different languages that use the same writing system. The dominant language in China is Mandarin, but there are other languages that are spoken, and that's very true and much more true even so back during this time. All right, let's talk about the religion of this culture. Right? All cultures develop these complex institutions. Religion is a very important one. So let's talk about the religious beliefs of the Chinese civilization. A really big component of this is ancestor worship. This belief that family and religion are very closely interlinked. Your family members, they die, they turn into spirits, and those spirits can actually influence you in this world, right? If you worship them properly, you give them honor, you do things that bring honor to their memory, you give them offerings, they can do things to bring you good fortune in this life. However, if you forget to worship them, you dishonor the family name, those spirits can get angry and they'll start breaking things and making your life miserable. Now, it's the duty of every family to offer sacrifices, not human sacrifices, but usually like incense burning, things like that, to honor the male ancestors of the culture, especially coming down from the father's line. So your dad's grandfather and his grandfather and so on and so forth, all the way back. It was a very male-dominated society, and even so today. Unfortunately, women didn't have a lot of rights. It wasn't just ancestor worship. They actually did have a polytheistic system of multiple gods. So polytheism is the belief that there are not just one god, but many gods out there. Now, Shangdi was seen as the supreme deity of all these different gods. There were lesser ones below them, but that was the main deity worshipped by the Shang dynasty and the people below them. In order to communicate with these gods to determine what they wanted the rulers to do, they actually used a system called oracle bones. This is where questions would be written on tortoise shells or different pieces of bones. So this is where we find some of the earliest forms of Chinese pictograph writing, and then they would be tossed into a fire, and priests would then look at them crack and interpret those cracks to determine the god's answer to your question. right? The question might be, should I go to war with country A or country B? And if the crack develops through the line country B, you can interpret that to mean don't go to war with country B, go to war with country A. Of course, you could also see that as saying, no, the crack means don't go to war with the other one. But this is why there's a lot of interpretation here. And just like we've seen in these other cultures, religion and government are very closely interlinked. Right? There's something called the dynastic cycle, where the ruling families would justify their power, say that we get to be in charge, we get to make the rules because we have something known as the mandate of heaven. And this means I'm in charge because the gods want me in charge. How do you know? Well, things are going great, aren't they? And as long as things are going right or great, it's a sign that the gods approve my family being in charge. That's what we call the mandate of heaven. So as long as there are no natural disasters or war, people are thriving, this is the sign that the gods like the ruling family, and thus you should follow the orders and laws of the ruling dynasty. However, if there are natural disasters, invasions from other peoples, rebellions, these bad things happening, people are no longer happy, they see that the gods are no longer then happy with the ruling family, and that gives justification for a different family to overthrow them and establish a new dynasty, a new ruling family with the blessings of the gods. This cycle repeats over and over in Chinese history, right? We've already in this lesson talked about the Xi dynasty, the Shang dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, and of course there's going to be the Han dynasty coming after them. So while this isn't something I have spots for in your notes, it might be a good idea to have this written down somewhere, pause, and write down this cycle, giving you an idea of how the Chinese people viewed government and its connection to the gods. Because as always in this class, we're going to see religion and government intricately connected until about 1776, when we get to the Enlightenment and we get this idea that maybe government and religion should be separated. But for most of human history, they're very closely linked. And as we're going to see in this class, it's going to lead to a lot of problems. Speaking of government, let's take a deeper dive into how their government operated and how they controlled their populations. One of the main tasks of government is to maintain what we call social order. Social order simply means keeping everything from getting chaotic, keeping things predictable. In China, social order, government, and family life are deeply interconnected. Each individual family was considered like a building block of the entire government itself. And at the head of each of these building blocks was the father, right? So family loyalty and respect for your elders, especially male elders, was extremely important. Women were taught to obey their husbands or fathers or eldest brothers if they were not married and their father wasn't alive. And children were taught to obey their father as well. Essentially, the dads in these households were considered mini kings within their home. Just as children and wives were expected to obey and respect the fathers in the family or husbands, everyone in society was taught to obey the emperor as if he was the father of all inside the empire. Essentially, everyone inside the empire is part of one giant family, and at the head of that household, the head of this family, is the emperor, who you must obey and respect at all costs. As you can tell, women in this society had very little power. Now, there were some notable women who did manage to rise to positions of authority, such as the Lady Hao from the Shang Dynasty. Despite these strict social expectations of women, she was allowed to lead at least one military campaign to battle where she led a force of 13,000 troops, and even took on the role of spiritual and ritual duties within the Shang Dynasty, a duty that's usually reserved only for distinguished members of the royal family, despite only being a consort, not an actual full-fledged member of the family. Again, here we see religion being used as a way to control the people within a state. As long as a ruling family is seen as having the mandate of heaven, challenging them is the same as challenging the gods. If you look at the map over here, you can see this light orange color right here represents the extent of the Zhou dynasty at their peak of power. That's actually quite a lot of territory, despite the fact it's not quite reaching the full size of what China is today. And considering the fastest form of communication at this time was by horseback, it can be difficult for one person to control this large territory. So in order to do this, the emperors turned to a strict hierarchy and feudalism. So like we've been talking about strict hierarchies, they divide people into very specific groups, each of these groups having different powers and different rights, different responsibilities. Now, of course, this is a very oversimplification of that hierarchy, but it helps you kind of start to grasp this concept. So what happened is the emperor got together with the nobles and they divided up all of the land into these different little territories. Each noble was allowed to act as kind of a mini king within those territories in exchange for their loyalty, military service, and the protection of the people living on the land. So you have these individual families essentially with living on these different lands, with the fathers being the head of each household. Those households combined add up into a single territory that's controlled by one of the nobles, and those nobles, their territories combine to create the entire Chinese empire of the Zhou dynasty as well. So that's kind of how the system works. You pay your taxes and your loyalty to the people above you. In exchange, the people above you promise protection. And that's kind of how this racket works. We'll dive a lot deeper into this when we get to the Middle Ages in Europe, where feudalism will take hold there as well. What's important to understand about this is that while the nobles governed their smaller regions as if they're kind of mini kings, they'd live in little walled towns where they would then kind of manage the administration of the laws, collecting taxes, and protecting the families that live within those territories surrounding the walled cities. But at the same time, these nobles were not all powerful. They had to obey the emperor, the king. And this is because the emperor was seen as having the mandate of heaven. This is the idea that the gods wanted the imperial family to be the one that's in charge. However, a common theme we see in history is that when you give someone power, they tend to want more power. Over time, many of these walled towns turn into prosperous cities, and the nobles begin to fight amongst themselves for more land and more power. This fighting will eventually end the Zhou dynasty, leading to a period that's known as the period of the Warring States, when local rulers acted more like independent kings instead of as vassals of the emperor. This again is one of those patterns we'll see repeat over and over again in this course. Okay, quick side-by-side of timelines that don't perfectly match up, but to give you an idea of what's going on here in relation to the last note video about the Indus Valley. So this dashed line here represents essentially the change between BCE and CE. You can see here that in the Indus Valley there are early farming villages just before the year 3000, but that doesn't really develop here in China until around the year 2000 BCE. So the Indus Valley gets started a little sooner. And around the time the tectonic plates are shifting and the Aryan nomads are migrating into the Indus Valley region, that is when we see the Shang dynasty in charge over in China. And then you'll notice that here, so after this point, there really isn't the Indus Valley Harappan civilizations from those previous notes. And while that collapses, we've got the Zhou dynasty kind of carrying on in China, followed by the Han dynasty, followed by other dynasties, and China really is the longest continuous civilization. And while these dynasties do get overturned, different families take over, and there's intermediate periods of warring states, China is considered the longest continuous running civilization in the history of the world because of this. So China gets started a little later than the Indus Valley, but lasts a heck of a lot longer, even into present day. Okay, hopefully you're used to this by now, but take a few minutes here, pause the video, rewrite today's goal, either from the top of the note sheet or from the beginning of this video. And again, I really want you to stop and actually type it out, not copy and paste, type it out. That's how it's going to stick in your head a little bit better. Then go through your notes and identify 3 important facts from these notes that help you understand this goal. And finally, I always want you to show that intellectual curiosity, write one question you still have, and I will respond to that on your note sheet. Well, until I see you in class, have a good one.